Hi, my name is Audrey Casper, and I decided to do my optimism presentation on Chesapeake Bay oyster restoration. Chesapeake is an Algonquian word for Great Shellfish Bay, which explains how ubiquitous the species used to be. One European settler described the bay's oysters, which lay on the ground, as thick as stones to give you a sense of how prevalent they used to be in the ecosystem. There's a native oyster to this region called the Virginia oyster, and they're super important for the ecosystem because they filter algae, pollutants, and sediment. One study found that restored reefs remove around 20,000 bags equivalent of garden fertilizer, which shows just how important they are to prevent eutrophication and other problems. And oyster reefs are also important habitats for blue crabs, which are also a super special species for this region. And currently, their population is at 1% of historic levels. Specific threats to oysters are this disease called derma, which is a parasite that slows down growth rates of these oysters and causes their death. And specifically because there's been increased drought and winter temperatures, this expands the parasite's range, which causes bigger problems within the population. There's also the issue of overfishing of oysters and poor water quality. So when algal growth makes oxygen dead zones, oysters can't lay their eggs in those regions, and the sediment suffocates oysters. So the stress of pollution and sediment makes them more susceptible to disease and causes even more exacerbated problems. However, there have been successful ways that scientists and ecological managers have been able to restore oyster reefs within the Chesapeake Bay. So 3 of these ways are oyster gardening, shell recycling, and reef construction. Oyster gardening is pretty much essentially a community project where they take fishermen, people who live along the bay, and they ask them to grow oysters along their docks, which help them grow their numbers in a way that isn't disruptive to their actual day-to-day lives, but gives them a safe place to live. And then eventually they transport those grown oysters onto sanctuary reefs. There's also shell recycling, which is when you take used shells from restaurants and other places and use them as a host environment for new growth for oysters. So around 2,000 bushels per year are dedicated to larval habitat. And you can see in this picture that on each recycled shell, it can be home to dozens of baby oysters, which are called spat. It's an important resource for them so they can continue to have new population growth. There's also reef construction, which helps mitigate erosion, increases oyster populations, and acts as a living shoreline to protect other species in the bay. These restoration techniques have shown a lot of successes. So there was a goal from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to restore 10 oyster reefs by 2025, and they've already completed reef construction for 8 of them, and you can see that in this graph about how much they're able to add. So they've added around 4.47 billion oysters to the ecosystem and have constructed around 1,000 acres of oyster reef, which is super impressive for having such a short timeline. This is not to say that the work is over for oyster restoration. They still have an F rating in terms of their success and their ability to persist into the future, but they've increased by 5 percentage points since last year, which shows that with consistent effort, you can get some of these successes. And we've seen the highest number of juvenile oysters in 30 plus years with these efforts. So while numbers are nowhere near historical levels, restoration steps taken can make us more optimistic about restoring the Chesapeake to the great shellfish bay it has once been.